Yeah. Family, y'all. Just keep it tight, keep it tight, keep it tight. Oh, right. Yeah. Here we go.
And so this quest for the historical Jesus, which began in the 1700s through the early 1900s, through Albert Schweitzer in 1906, essentially the question is, what can we know about Jesus? There are all these stories that are told about Jesus. Later in this class, we're going to use the word myth, and we're going to understand what that means when we talk about myths concerning Jesus. We have all sorts of stories and myths. The question becomes then, what does all of that mean for the real Jesus? Did the real Jesus, to go back to the example that we used previously, did the real Jesus walk on water in the same way that I'm walking on this floor? And if so, was he human? Right? If we say that Jesus was fully human and fully divine, if he was fully human, can human beings walk on water? Deacon Claire's want to try it for us? Right? Walk across a swimming pool. Human beings cannot walk across a swimming pool. It's impossible. But why was the story written? To show that Jesus is God. That Jesus is divine. So let's strip away the divine for now, because historians can't prove anything about the divine, right? They can't prove that Jesus rose from the dead or anything like that. But we can talk about the human. Historians can. So back beginning with the Enlightenment, we said, let's focus here first and see if we can work from here to the divine. So far, so good? Let's begin with the historical Jesus. What can we really know about him, and what does that lead us to believe? So how interesting that we've studied already ancient philosophy, the philosophy of the ancient Greeks. How interesting that they started asking questions about the world. What happened was we started raising questions and developing a philosophy. Then eventually we went into the Dark Ages, where we were occupied with other things like the plague and invading barbarians and things that took our mind off of these sorts of great questions. Eventually then the Enlightenment comes, where we find ourselves able to focus again on these sorts of questions, and we find ourselves asking questions. Which is why philosophy, especially modern philosophy, is going to be great, because once the Middle Ages are over and the church is no longer controlling thought, as it did with philosophy in the medieval times, then these philosophers are going to start trying to think about things in a new way and ask questions. They're going to be skeptics. People like David Hume and Hegel and Kant. We're going to have a new breed of skeptics with the Enlightenment. How is this going to affect Christology and religion? Immanuel Kant was one of those philosophers. His motto was "Sapere aude," which simply means in English, dare to know, dare to ask questions, right? Dare to really, really come to know something. Ask questions until you get to the bottom of something. Ooh, what's it going to do for our faith? What happens with our faith? We start to ask questions to get to the bottom of who Jesus is. Ooh, this may be unsettling to a few people. So in the Enlightenment then, when we start to ask questions, then essentially the purpose is for us to free ourselves from the past. So just because you believe things in the past doesn't necessarily mean they're true. How it is that we can start to free people from what they used to believe. Various concepts that we used to believe in, okay, do we have to continue to believe in those things? How can we prove that those things are or are not? Especially things that have to deal with religion. Can you prove God exists? Ultimately, it seems it comes down to a matter of faith more than reason. As philosophers, we tried to reason about God's existence. That wasn't so helpful. Ultimately, we came down to how it is that either you have faith or you don't. In this world, either you have faith and you call yourself by one name, whatever name that is, depending on your spirituality or religion, or you don't have faith, so you use other words like agnostic, I don't know that God exists, or atheist, I don't believe that God exists. The Enlightenment, what's fascinating about then was it was really an anti-religious movement. Let's just put this in context. Remember our course on church history? There was so much corruption in the church. What could you believe, right? When you have all these corrupt bishops and popes and they're telling you something, can you believe it? That's the challenge. Because we see how it is that this church is so corrupt. The question becomes, can we believe what these people in the church are telling us? And so it really became an anti-religious movement focusing on critical thinking. The Enlightenment was also a movement from substance to subject. Let's unpack that. Remember in our course of ancient philosophy, what were we focused on? The substance of things, right? What a thing is in itself. It was like that in the early years of the church too. When we were at those first councils, we were focusing on the substance of Christ, that Christ was of one substance, of one being. With the Father, the focus was on being. Now, with the Enlightenment, the focus is no longer on being, it's now on the subject. We often refer to it as the turn to the subject. Rather than talking about being, which is somehow out here somewhere, who are we talking about now? We're talking about you. And you, and you, and you, and you, and me. We're talking about us as human subjects and our experience. Which is why ultimately we're going to come to this belief where it's not just one person possessing the truth, but in this room, currently, there are 12 subjects, all of whom see something from different perspectives. And while I can tell you that this book says the Bible, this is the Bible. It says the Bible in gold letters, because can't you see it? And he's going to tell me he can't see it. And I'm going to tell him he is a fool because this is a Bible and it's a black book with gold letters that says Holy Bible. And if you can't see it, then I'm sorry, you're wrong. What's happening? We all see the same thing, but what? From different perspectives. Does that mean that I'm right and the other person is wrong? No, it simply means that we're looking at the same thing from other perspectives, which is why the turn to the subject is so important. Because now we're not just talking about truth that's out there somewhere with a capital T, or the good with a capital G, or beauty with a capital B, something that's out there somewhere. What are we talking about? We're talking about every single person's experience of that object. So that what's good for one person, what one person says is good, might not be the same as another person. We might see things differently. The truth. One person might see one truth, one person might see another truth. And isn't that true in religion, right? A Christian sees truth from one perspective, a Muslim from another perspective, a Hindu, a Sikh, we all have different perspectives on the truth. All that began as part of the Enlightenment with the turn to the subject. Every subject in this room, every person in this room has his or her own experience. You start with your experience. Don't start with all these high philosophical ideas. Start with your experience. In the ancient mind, the human person was a substance. Now in the Enlightenment, we're not a substance. We are a subject. For the ancients, we were preformed and predetermined. There was no becoming. And for the ancients also, our actions affect only the accidents of our being, those things that we see and taste and touch, those things that we sense. Know that the being never changes, the being always remains the same. The Enlightenment is going to challenge all of these notions. That we are in history, we're all born, we grow, and we develop in our consciousness of ourselves and of our world. And we became aware of the fact that we are determined by outer forces, and we determine. We shape history, and we influence others. And what happens as well? Others influence us. Isn't that true? In your own upbringing as a child, we can all point to the people who influenced us. And if we were honest, we could all look around now and think of the people that we influence as well. And isn't that what it means to be a human being? In the Enlightenment, we came to this notion that we are different from any other animal. Why? Because we think. And we're conscious of how it is that we think. Descartes, what was his famous saying? I think, therefore I am. He came up with the marvelous thing with this turn to the subject now. He's not starting with some sort of big philosophical concept out there. What is he starting with? His own experience. Also, during this time then, as part of this historical consciousness, how it is that we influence others and others influence us, how it is that we help to make history. Think about that for a moment. If history is going to be made, we could do it together. We don't have to rely on some king in the castle to make decisions for us. You know what? We could create our own destiny. Think of the dangerous notion that that is in any kingdom, right? People are going to start thinking, wait a minute, we could be creating history and governing ourselves rather than being governed. So we have the context in which we root then this quest for the historical Jesus is within the Enlightenment, within this period of rationalism, which included the likes of Voltaire and Immanuel Kant and Lessing. We remember was the one who published the work by Reimarez. A movement toward skepticism, prove it, right? If you say something, prove it. Jesus walked on water, prove it. Right? Jesus multiplied bread, ha ha ha. Let me see you multiply the bread and then maybe I'll believe that Jesus did the same. Right? Skepticism, where there's, as historians then, when we talk about the Jesus of history, that's where we started to focus. Rather than focusing on the Christ of faith, because we're going to disagree about this. Can we just agree on that right now? If we start talking about the Christ of faith, we're going to disagree. Follow me? If we talk about the Jesus of history, there are probably some things that we could agree on, right? That Jesus was born in a certain culture at a certain time, right? That he was a Jew. That his name was not Jesus, but in his culture, in his language, Aramaic, it would have been Yeshua. We can agree on a few things when we talk about the Jesus of history. It becomes more dangerous when it comes to the Christ of faith, right? Because we'll all have different beliefs. We'll all be looking at that same Jesus or that same Christ from different perspectives. So, in the Enlightenment mind then, let's begin with what we can all agree on, the Jesus of history. Make sense? Because when we turn to history as a discipline, as a subject, there's no revelation or miracles or revealed religion. Miracles, think of any miracle of Jesus. What's your favorite miracle of Jesus? Think about your own favorite miracle of Jesus or your own favorite miracle in the Bible. Wait a minute. As historians, those are problematic. Because have you seen any big miracles lately? Like a fire coming down out of the heaven and consuming things? Of people being turned into salt? Have you seen anything like that lately? Right? So the challenge is, we have these different stories in the Bible. The question is how to make sense of them. Were they real history, or we did somehow understand them differently? So the Enlightenment suggested that we peel away all the things that we can't believe and agree on, all of us, to see what it is that everyone in this room, all 12 of us, can agree on. How does that sound? When we come to Jesus, then we're going to start peeling away anything that anyone could disagree on. Walking on water. Do you think walking on water is going to stay and we can all 12 of us agree on that? Well, maybe the 12 in this room, but imagine if we had different thoughts on the issue, right? When we start introducing people of other faiths or other cultures, would they agree? Probably not. There's a note that is included in the notes that we have from Father Donald Buggart, who has a doctorate in studying these sorts of things. He talks about how it is that during this, through the lenses of rationalism, religion was for the weak-minded. I'm not saying this. This was a thought for those who are skeptics, essentially saying, if you're a religious person, why are you a religious person? Because you're not strong enough to reason through these things and come to make sense of the world. Rather, you need to rely on these gods or whatever it is that you're inventing to make sense of the world. It was a strong accusation against the church and religion, but put it in context, we were coming out of these Middle Ages where we had a very corrupt church in need of reform and that was being reformed, where people were starting to question the people who were in power in the church. Pre-Enlightenment Christianity, imagine it for a moment, before all of this skepticism, when we read the Bible and we read stories of Jesus multiplying bread and fish or walking on water, whatever he was doing, before skepticism and the Enlightenment, we believed one thing. After the Enlightenment, yikes, suddenly we start sharing these stories, even with our children. Our children have gone off to college and have started learning all these disciplines, and they come starting to question these things. Wait a minute. That creates a problem for us, because pre-Enlightenment Christianity looked at the Gospels as if they were history. At the beginning of this class, before we started the recording, what did Raphael say? That the Bible is not a book of history. What's it a book of? Theology. Which means it has to do with our faith. It's not a book of history, saying that these things happened historically, that a woman was really turned into salt by God, or that God opened up the earth so that it would swallow a person. Yikes. Instead, these are stories of our faith that tell us about God as we believe God to be at that time. So according to pre-Enlightenment Christianity, Jesus knew that he was the Messiah, the Savior, the Lord. Jesus knew that he was God, and Jesus was proving that he was God through miracles. After we became a bit more skeptical about all of this, we started looking at it and saying, did Jesus really believe that he was God and do these things to prove that he was God? Or did other people who believed that start saying those things about Jesus? How do you strip away the various layers of stories to get to the real Jesus? Just because someone said that Father Jamie flew in from France today, does that mean that Father Jamie was in France yesterday? No, I mean, great story. Wish it were true, but it doesn't mean it was true, right? Think of any story that you could make up. Just because you make up that story doesn't mean it's true. So for the people of the Enlightenment now, the only valid knowledge of God is philosophical knowledge, which is why, for instance, in our course of philosophy, we start with these ideas to try to figure out what God is like. And those are the only valid ideas. In the Enlightenment mind, God has to make sense. If you're going to believe in a God, your faith has to somehow make sense. Which is why theology is faith-seeking understanding, seeking reason. Faith-seeking reason. So if you strip away all of this, what are the skeptics going to say? When you strip away all of the miracles and all those fantastic stories of Jesus, what are you left with? Are you left with a very fantastic picture of Jesus? He was a person like the rest of us. A good teacher, maybe. But someone who is not like, who is, it's no longer a high Christology. It's not a high Christology. What are we left with? A very low Christology. And what do we remember? That a low Christology is no Christology at all. We don't go to Mass on Sundays to worship another human being. We go there because we believe that Jesus was God, Jesus was Christ. Hegel was a philosopher in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Have we heard that name before? He said, human history is the history of Geist, of God's self-communication, God's self-emptying. So we had these medieval mystics, the Platonists, remember the Platonists and the Neo-Platonists? What did they believe? That God overflows in goodness, and it's sort of like that's what comes to us in Revelation. That in history, God is telling us about God's self, and that's what human history is. It's the history of God communicating God's self to us. So human history is really what? God's history. We are passive actors through which divine history is taking place. So it's really the history that our students are studying in school every day. Got news for you. According to Hegel, that history is not about people doing things. It's about divine history, the history of God being accomplished in people like us. It's the history of Geist. Our history is the history of Geist. It's God's history. History is all about God's grace. And so there would be various schools of thought when it came to Hegel. The right-wing Hegelians, for instance, would claim that we have no freedom, because if God is in control of history, what does that mean? If God knows what's going to happen in the future, are you free? If God knows you're going to do something, got news for you, you got to do it. If God knows that you're not going to do something, got news for you, you can't do it. If God knows the future, then you're no longer free. Right-wing Hegelians then come to the conclusion that we're no longer free as human beings. Left-wing Hegelians come to another conclusion that, you know what, maybe the whole thing, maybe it's not about God, it's about us making history. Some of the great atheists were left-wing Hegelians, atheists like Bruno Bauer, Feuerbach, Marx, turning Hegel upside down. Hegel said that our history is God's history. They looked at it and laughed and said, God's history, what? Our history is our history. And then there are also Catholics. Catholics are not right-wing Hegelians or left-wing Hegelians. We're more centrists, where it's God and humans working together. Think about that for a moment. It's not just about God. It's not just about us. But maybe it's about us cooperating with God and co-making history together. How's that for a theology?